She had exactly one suitcase and nowhere in Lagos left to call home when Amarachi Obi landed in Seoul with a work visa and a broken heart. Her family had chosen her stepbrother's business debts over her name on the family land, and she had walked away rather than watch them sell what her father built. What she didn't know was that the quiet, dangerous man who ran half the city from the shadows had been watching her from across a hotel lobby for exactly 4 minutes before he decided she was his. And once Kang Min-ho decided something, the whole underworld of Seoul rearranged itself around that decision. If you have ever been left behind by the people who were supposed to love you first, stay until the end of this one, because this story is for you. Comment the word chosen if you believe the family you build can be stronger than the one you were born into, and subscribe now, because what happens between Amarachi and Min-ho is going to wreck you in the best way. Let's begin. Amarachi Obi had been in Seoul for 6 days when she took the job at the Gyeonggi Hotel, the kind of 5-star property where the marble floors cost more than her mother's entire house back in Enugu. She wasn't proud. Pride was a luxury she'd left behind at the airport gate when her stepfather told her, in front of the whole extended family, that she was not really theirs to worry about anymore. 26 years old, a hospitality degree she'd earned working nights, and a savings account that had exactly enough to cover 2 months of rent in a country where she didn't speak the language and didn't know a single soul. She learned to bow at the correct angle. She learned which floors required a keycard and which required silence. She learned that the man who occupied the entire top floor of the East Tower was someone the other staff did not discuss above a whisper. "You do not make eye contact," the head concierge told her on her second day, voice low like she was handing over a secret that could get someone fired, or worse. "You do not ask questions. If Mr. Kang requests something, you provide it and you leave the room." "Who is Mr. Kang?" Amarachi asked. The concierge's face did something complicated. "Someone you don't want to know." She should have listened. She didn't. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of grey Seoul afternoon where the sky couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain. Amarachi was covering the private lounge on the top floor because the usual attendant had called in sick, and she had exactly one job: deliver a pot of tea to the man in the corner suite and disappear before he noticed her. She did not disappear fast enough. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window when she entered, his back to her, dressed in black from collar to cuff, the kind of stillness that made a room feel colder. She set the tray down without a sound, the way she'd been trained, and turned to leave. "You're new," he said. He hadn't turned around. "Yes, sir." "You didn't knock." "I did knock, sir. Twice." She kept her voice even, professional, even though her heart had started doing something unpleasant in her chest. There was no answer. He turned then. And Amarachi understood, in that one unhurried moment, exactly why every person in this hotel spoke about him like he was something dangerous kept on a leash. His eyes were dark and assessing, moving over her face like he was cataloguing something for later use. He was younger than she expected, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of face that belonged on the cover of a magazine and the kind of stillness that belonged in a war room. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amarachi." She hesitated, then added, "Obi. I'm Nigerian." "I know what an Amarachi is." His mouth didn't move, but something in his eyes shifted, sharpened with interest he clearly wasn't used to feeling. "It means God's grace." She blinked, startled. "You know Igbo." "I know things that are useful to know." He walked toward the tray she'd set down, poured the tea himself, which she'd never seen a guest do in 6 days of watching wealthy men expect to be served. "You're not afraid of me." "Should I be?" Something almost like amusement crossed his face. "Everyone else is." "I don't know you well enough to be afraid of you yet," she said, and immediately regretted the boldness of it, because the head concierge's warning was ringing in her ears like a fire alarm. "I'm sorry. That was inappropriate. I'll go." "Stay," he said. Not a request. A command, delivered so quietly it took her a second to register it as one. She stayed. They didn't talk about anything important that first afternoon. He asked where she was from, and she told him about Enugu, about the red earth and the noise of the market and the family that had decided she was disposable the moment she stopped being useful. She didn't know why she told him that last part. Something about the way he listened, like her words actually mattered and weren't just filling silence, pulled the truth out of her before she could stop it. "They let you go because you refused to sign over your father's land," he said, not a question. She stared at him. "I didn't tell you that part." "You didn't have to." His jaw tightened, just slightly, the first real emotion she'd seen cross his face. Family that trades you for money isn't family. It's a transaction that finally showed its true price. Something in her chest cracked open, just a little, at hearing a stranger say out loud the thing she'd been too afraid to say to herself. The next day, there were flowers waiting at the staff entrance with her name on the card. Just her first name, written in handwriting so precise it looked engraved. No note. No explanation. She should have reported it. She didn't. A week later, she was in charge of the top-floor lounge permanently. She told herself it was a coincidence, a scheduling decision made by someone above her pay grade. She didn't yet understand that in Kang Min-ho's world, nothing was a coincidence. Every arrangement of the universe near him existed because he had made a phone call. The following Friday, he asked her to sit with him while he drank his tea. Not stand. Sit. She hesitated at the door until he said, quietly, "I'm asking, not ordering." She Saturday. "Tell me about your father," he said. And for the first time in months, Amarachi talked about someone she loved without her voice shaking with grief that had nowhere to go. 2 weeks passed like that. Thursdays and Fridays became something she found herself looking forward to with an intensity that scared her. She learned things about him in fragments, the way you learn a language you're not fluent in yet. That he ran companies whose names appeared in business journals but whose real operations never made it to print. That the staff at the hotel treated his floor like sacred, dangerous ground. That underneath the composure, there was a man who had built walls so high he'd forgotten there was a person living behind them. Then came the night everything changed. She was walking home from a late shift, 3 blocks from her apartment in a part of Seoul that wasn't dangerous exactly, just poorly lit, when a man stepped out of a doorway and grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise. He said something in Korean she didn't understand, but his intent needed no translation. She screamed. She fought. And then, impossibly, headlights swung around the corner, tires screeching against wet asphalt, and a car door opened before it had even fully stopped. Kang Min-ho crossed the distance between the car and her attacker in a way that didn't look human, didn't look like the composed man who drank tea and asked about her father. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. The man who had grabbed her was on the ground, and Min-ho was standing over him with an expression Amarachi had never seen on another human being, something cold enough to stop her breath in her throat. "Are you hurt?" he asked her, turning, and his voice was suddenly, achingly gentle, a total contradiction to the violence that had just occurred 3 feet away. I'm fine." Her hands were shaking. "How did you know where?" "I always know where you are." He said it like it was obvious, like it wasn't the most alarming sentence a person could say to someone they'd known for 3 weeks. Then, seeing her face, something shifted in his. That came out wrong. Did it? He exhaled, long and slow, the first crack in his armor she'd witnessed. "I have people watching over you. Since the 2nd week. I should have told you. You've had me followed." She stepped back, putting distance between them, even though every part of her wanted to close it instead. "Why?" "Because Seoul is not always safe for a woman alone, and because," he stopped himself, jaw working. "Because I couldn't stand the thought of something happening to you and me not being close enough to stop it." If you are hooked on this story right now, comment the word protector and let's see how many of you can guess what Min-ho is hiding before it's revealed. Now, back to the story. He drove her home that night. Not to her cramped 1-room apartment with a leaking faucet, but insisted on walking her to the door, insisted on checking every window, insisted on leaving 2 of his men stationed outside without asking her permission first. "I don't need bodyguards," she told him at her door, arms crossed. "You need them tonight." His voice left no room for argument. "Tomorrow we can discuss whether you need them permanently." "There's no discussing that. This is my life, Min-ho. Not yours to manage." Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, at the use of his given name without the honorific, Or maybe at being told no by someone who had every reason to be grateful and chose defiance instead. "You're right," he said finally. "I apologize. But I'm leaving the men outside tonight regardless, because I will not be able to sleep otherwise, and that is my problem to manage, not yours." She almost smiled despite everything. "That's a strange kind of apology. I'm not very practiced at them." The following morning, there was a folder waiting at the hotel front desk with her name on it. Inside was everything: an apartment listing in a secure building with round-the-clock staff, a new phone with an emergency contact programmed in, a note that said simply, "You don't have to use any of this. But it exists if you want it." She didn't use it. Not at first. She was too stubborn, too aware of what accepting gifts from a man like Kang Min-ho might mean. Too raised by a mother who taught her that a woman who took things from powerful men eventually owed them everything. But he didn't push. That was the strange, disarming part. He simply kept showing up, on Thursdays and Fridays, drinking his tea, asking about her day, listening like her words were the most important information in his world. And slowly, without either of them quite naming it, the tea became dinner, and the dinner became conversations that lasted until midnight, and the conversations became something neither of them had a word for yet. A month into whatever this had become, she found out what he actually did. It happened by accident, the way most dangerous truths do. She was walking past his office on the top floor, a door left slightly open, and she heard him speaking in a tone she'd never heard him use, flat and merciless, giving instructions about a shipment and a rival organization and consequences that made her blood run cold. She stood frozen in the hallway until he ended the call, and when he turned and saw her standing there, his face went through several expressions before settling on something like resignation. "You heard that?" "I heard enough." He gestured for her to come inside, closed the door behind her. "I run a syndicate, Amarachi. Not a hotel chain, not an import business, though those exist too, as cover. I control territory in this city that the police don't touch and the government pretends doesn't exist. My father built it. I inherited it, and I have spent 15 years making sure it doesn't fall apart." He paused. "I should have told you sooner. I was afraid of what you'd do with the truth." "What did you think I'd do?" "Run." She stood very still, processing this, turning it over the way she turned over every hard truth life had handed her since the moment she landed in this country with one suitcase and no safety net. "Are you going to hurt me?" "Never." The word came out immediate, fierce, the most emotion she'd heard from him yet. "I would burn this entire city to ash before I let anything touch you. That is the one truth in all of this you should never doubt." "That's not comforting, Min-ho. It's not meant to be comforting. It's meant to be honest." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion behind his composure, the weight of 15 years of a life he never chose. "I'm asking you to decide with full knowledge of who I am. Not the version I let the hotel staff see. This one." She should have walked away that night. Every rational part of her screamed at her to walk away. Instead, she stayed until 1 a.m., asking questions he answered honestly, watching a dangerous man slowly, carefully, hand her every piece of ammunition she could use to destroy him and trusting she wouldn't. She didn't leave. But she also didn't say yes to anything yet, not the apartment, not the security, not the thing growing between them that neither of them had named out loud. 2 weeks later, everything accelerated, because that is how danger works. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. She was closing up the lounge, alone, later than usual, when a man she'd never seen before stepped into the room like he owned it. He was polished, expensive-looking, with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You must be the housekeeper Kang Min-ho has been so distracted by," he said in accented English, circling her like he was assessing merchandise. "I'm Seo Dae-hyun. Perhaps he's mentioned me." He hadn't. But something in the way the man said the name made her skin prickle with instinct older than reason. "I don't discuss Mr. Kang's business," she said carefully. "Smart girl." He smiled wider. "You should know, before you get too attached, that men like Min-ho don't marry housekeepers. They use them and discard them when the family finally forces a proper match. I'd hate for you to be surprised later. I think you should leave." I think you should consider what happens to a woman connected to Kang Min-ho when his enemies decide she's worth more as leverage than she is to him as a distraction. He was closer now, too close, and Amarachi's heart pounded against her ribs. Tell him Seo Daehyun sends his regards. Tell him the board is watching how distracted he's become. He left as quietly as he'd arrived, leaving Amarachi shaking against the counter, her mind racing through everything he'd said, the threat wrapped so carefully in politeness she almost hadn't recognized it for what it was. She told Min-ho everything that same night. She watched his face go through fury, then something colder and more controlled, then a kind of grim calculation she was starting to recognize as the version of him that made decisions that ended careers and sometimes lives. He will not touch you, Min-ho said, voice low and lethal. I promise you that. I'm not asking for a promise. I'm asking what this means. Who is he to you? A rival who has spent 3 years trying to find a weakness he can exploit. Min-ho's hands curled into fists at his sides. I removed every attachment from my life specifically so no one could ever use it against me. And then you walked into my lounge with tea and questions I didn't know how to stop answering, and I let myself want something for the first time in 15 years. He met her eyes. You are now the weakness he's found, Amarachi. I'm sorry for that. I never meant to put you in danger. So what do? We make sure he understands that touching you costs him everything. By the end of that week, security around the hotel tripled. Amarachi found a man discreetly walking 3 steps behind her every time she left the building. She hated it, argued about it twice, and eventually stopped arguing, because underneath the frustration was something she hadn't expected to feel: safety. For the first time since her family cast her out, someone was standing between her and the world's cruelty and refusing to move. That was the night she finally accepted the apartment. I'm not doing this because I need saving, she told him, standing in the doorway of the new place, secure and warm and nothing like the cramped room she'd been living in. I'm doing this because I trust you. There's a difference. I know the difference, he said quietly. Thank you for trusting me with it. The next few weeks blurred into something dangerously close to happiness. He came by more often than the schedule required. He learned she liked jollof rice better than any Korean dish he introduced her to, and started keeping the ingredients stocked in his own kitchen for the nights she cooked for both of them. He learned the sound of her laugh carried further than she realized, and that hearing it from another room did something to his chest he didn't have language for. He never touched her beyond small, careful things, a hand at the small of her back guiding her through a crowded room, fingers brushing hers when passing a cup of tea. He was waiting, she realized. Waiting for her to close the distance herself, because he understood, better than most men in his position ever bothered to, that a woman who had been discarded by everyone who claimed to love her needed to choose, not be chosen for. She closed the distance on a rainy Tuesday night, 3 months after the tea and the tray and the question about her father. They were in his penthouse, the storm outside rattling the windows, and she had just finished telling him about her mother's last phone call, the one where her mother had cried and apologized and asked for money anyway. Min-ho had listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and when she finished, her voice cracking on the last word, he reached over and wiped a tear from her cheek with a gentleness that felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who wasn't feared across an entire city. You deserve people who choose you without conditions, he said quietly. I intend to be one of those people, if you'll let me. Min-ho. I'm not asking for an answer tonight. His hand was still against her cheek. I'm just telling you the truth, since we agreed on that a long time ago. She kissed him instead of answering. It was soft at first, hesitant, both of them testing the ground beneath something neither had planned on falling into. Then his hand slid into her hair and she felt the careful control he wore like armor finally crack, just for her, just in this room, and the kiss deepened into something that stole the breath from both their lungs. They didn't rush what came after. The lights dimmed low, the storm outside providing its own soundtrack, and what passed between them that night was less about desire and more about 2 broken people finally letting someone else see the pieces. When morning came, Amarachi woke wrapped in his arms, sunlight cutting soft lines across the room, and for one perfect, unguarded moment, she let herself believe this could actually last. Then the fear crept in, the way it always did for a woman who had learned that good things were usually taken from her before she got to keep them. She slipped out before he woke, dressed quietly, and was halfway to the door when his voice stopped her. "Where are you going?" "I need space to think." She didn't turn around. "I need to figure out if this was real or if it was just the storm and the wine and two lonely people." "Amarachi." He was out of bed now, standing close but not touching. "Look at me." She did, and what she saw in his face nearly broke her resolve to leave. "I have never in my life woken up and wanted someone to still be there the way I wanted you to be there this morning. That is not the storm. That is not loneliness. That is you. You say that now. I will say it every day if that's what it takes." His voice cracked, just slightly, the sound of a man unused to begging for anything. "Don't run from me because you're afraid I'll leave first. I promise you, I won't." She left anyway. Not forever, just for the day, needing air and distance and time to convince her heart it was safe to want something this much again. She spent the day walking the city, her security discreetly trailing 3 steps behind, and by evening, she'd made a decision. She was walking back toward her apartment when the black van pulled up beside her. It happened fast, faster than she could process, hands grabbing her from both sides, a cloth pressed over her mouth that smelled sickly sweet, her vision tunneling to black before she could even scream properly. The last thing she registered was her security guard on the ground, unmoving, and a voice she recognized, cold and pleased, saying, "Tell Kang Min-ho that Seo Daehyun sends his regards." If you're feeling your heart race right now, that's exactly the point. Comment the word danger if you need to know Amarachi survives this, and stay with me, because what Min-ho does next is going to change how you think about love and power forever. Min-ho received the call at 6:47 in the evening. His head of security's voice was tight, controlled in the way that meant something catastrophic was happening and everyone was trying not to panic him further. "She's gone," Choi said. "Taken outside building 4. Her guard is down, alive but unconscious. There's a note. Read it to me." Min-ho's voice had gone somewhere flat and terrible, a place his men had only heard him go twice before in 15 years, both times right before someone's entire operation was destroyed to ash. It says, "You should have kept your weaknesses hidden better. Come alone to the old shipyard at midnight if you want her back breathing." Min-ho set down his phone with a precision that frightened the 3 men in the room more than shouting would have. "Get me everything we have on Seo Daehyun's operations. Every warehouse, every safe house, every man on his payroll. I want it in 20 minutes. Sir, if you go alone." I didn't say I'd go alone in the way he expects. Something dangerous moved behind Min-ho's eyes. "Choi, mobilize everyone. Every asset, every favor I have ever been owed. Cash it tonight. Seo Daehyun made a mistake tonight that he will not survive making." Amarachi woke up in a cold room that smelled like rust and salt water, her wrists bound to a chair, her head throbbing from whatever had been on that cloth. Seo Daehyun sat across from her, calm, sipping tea like this was a business meeting instead of a kidnapping. "You're awake," he said pleasantly. "Good. I'd hate for you to miss the show. What do you want?" "I want Kang Min-ho to understand that no man is untouchable, no matter how much he believes otherwise." He set down his cup. "You're simply the tool I'm using to teach him that lesson. Nothing personal." "It's very personal to me," Amarachi said, and despite the fear coursing through her, her voice came out steadier than she expected. 3 years of being discarded by people who claimed to love her had taught her something useful after all. How to survive being made small by people who thought they had power over her. Daehyun's smile flickered, just slightly, at her defiance. "Interesting. He does have taste." Midnight came slow and cold. Min-ho arrived at the shipyard exactly as instructed, alone, unarmed as far as anyone could see, walking into the warehouse where Daehyun waited with Amarachi still bound to the chair, 3 armed men positioned around the room. "Right on time," Daehyun said. "I appreciate punctuality." "Let her go." Min-ho's voice was quiet, controlled, but Amarachi could see the fury contained behind every syllable, barely leashed. "This is between us. She has nothing to do with our business. She has everything to do with it now." Dae-hyun gestured to the empty chair across from him. Sit. Let's talk terms. There are no terms until she's free. Oh, but there are. Dae-hyun's smile turned sharp. You transfer control of the Northern District to me. Tonight. Or I make sure your little Nigerian housekeeper never leaves this warehouse breathing. Min-ho's eyes never left Amarachi's face, and something passed between them in that look, a promise, a steadiness that told her to trust him even now, especially now. You think I came here without a plan, Min-ho said quietly. You think 15 years of surviving men exactly like you taught me nothing. Dae-hyun's confidence flickered for the first time. What are you talking about? That was when the lights went out. Chaos erupted in the darkness, shouting, the sound of a door being breached, gunfire that made Amarachi scream despite herself. When the emergency lights flared back on seconds later, Dae-hyun's men were on the ground, disarmed, Min-ho's own security flooding the room from an entrance no one had guarded because no one had known to expect it. Dae-hyun himself stood frozen, gun raised toward Amarachi, his composure finally, completely gone. Drop it, Min-ho said, and there was something in his voice now that had nothing left of the careful, controlled man who drank tea in hotel lounges. This was the man who had built an empire from nothing, who had survived 15 years in a world that ate weaker men alive. You think you've won, Dae-hyun said, but his hand was shaking. You think this ends here. It ends the second you put that gun down and walk away from this city forever. Min-ho stepped closer, slow and deliberate. Or it ends with you on this floor. Your choice. I genuinely do not care which. The standoff stretched, unbearable seconds ticking past while Amarachi held her breath, watching the man she loved stand between her and death with a calm that terrified and comforted her in equal measure. Dae-hyun lowered the gun. What followed happened fast, Min-ho's men closing in, Dae-hyun taken into custody by people who existed outside any court system Amarachi understood, and then Min-ho was in front of her, cutting the ropes from her wrists with hands that weren't quite steady despite everything. I'm sorry, he said, voice breaking for the first time since she'd known him. I'm so sorry. This is my fault. I brought this danger into your life and... Min-ho. She reached up, cupped his face with hands still trembling from adrenaline. You came for me. I will always come for you. He pressed his forehead to hers, breathing her in like he was reassuring himself she was real. Always. Do you understand that? There is no version of my life now that doesn't have you standing in the center of it. I was leaving to think, she whispered. I want you to know that. Not to leave you. To figure out how to stop being afraid you'd leave first. I'm not going anywhere. His voice was fierce, certain. Not now, not ever. You are the only thing in 15 years of building an empire that has ever felt like it actually mattered. Dae-hyun lowered the gun. What followed happened fast, Min-ho's men closing in, Dae-hyun taken into custody by people who existed outside any court system Amarachi understood, and then Min-ho was in front of her, cutting the ropes from her wrists with hands that weren't quite steady despite everything. I'm sorry, he said, voice breaking for the first time since she'd known him. I'm so sorry. This is my fault. I brought this danger into your life and... Min-ho. She reached up, cupped his face with hands still trembling from adrenaline. You came for me. I will always come for you. He pressed his forehead to hers, breathing her in like he was reassuring himself she was real. Always. Do you understand that? There is no version of my life now that doesn't have you standing in the center of it. I was leaving to think, she whispered. I want you to know that. Not to leave you. To figure out how to stop being afraid you'd leave first. I'm not going anywhere. His voice was fierce, certain. Not now, not ever. You are the only thing in 15 years of building an empire that has ever felt like it actually mattered. She kissed him then, in a cold warehouse that smelled like rust and danger, and it felt like the beginning of something neither of them had believed they were allowed to have. If you're not crying yet, comment the word survived because we're not done, and this story has one more chapter left that's going to make everything worth it. Keep watching. The weeks that followed were quieter, safer, the kind of ordinary Amarachi hadn't let herself believe she deserved. Dae-hyun's organization collapsed within days of his removal, his territory absorbed or scattered, and Min-ho, for the first time in 15 years, began the slow, deliberate process of pulling his empire toward something legitimate. It wasn't fast. It wasn't easy. But every step he took with her beside him, asking her opinion on decisions he'd never once asked anyone else about. His grandmother, a formidable woman who ran the family's remaining traditional business interests with an iron will, requested a meeting 3 weeks after the warehouse. Amarachi arrived expecting judgment and found instead a sharp-eyed old woman who studied her for a long, silent moment before speaking. "You are the one who made my grandson smile again," she said, not a question. "I don't know if I did that, I do." The old woman's expression softened, just barely. "He has not smiled like that since before his father died. Whatever you are doing, keep doing it." His mother, when she finally arrived from Busan 2 months later, was harder to win over, full of quiet questions about heritage and suitability that Amarachi answered honestly, without apology, refusing to shrink herself into something more palatable for a woman who hadn't earned the right to make her feel small. By the end of the visit, his mother hugged her at the door, unprompted, and whispered, "Thank you for loving him the way he needed to be loved." 6 months after the tea tray and the storm in the warehouse, Min-ho took her back to the rooftop garden of the hotel where they'd first met, the same place she'd once delivered a pot of tea to a stranger she'd been warned never to make eye contact with. "Do you remember this spot?" he asked. "I remember being terrified of you." "You've never been terrified of me a day in your life," he said, and the almost smile that crossed his face still made her chest ache with how far he'd come from the man who hadn't smiled in years. He got down on one knee, right there among the flowering vines and city lights, and pulled a small box from his jacket. "Amarachi Obi, your family let you go because they couldn't see what they had. I have spent every day since I met you making sure you never doubt that I see exactly what I have, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it. Marry me." She said yes before he'd even finished the sentence, laughing and crying at the same time, and when he slipped the ring onto her finger, it felt like every door that had ever been slammed shut on her was finally, impossibly, opening into something whole. They married 3 months later in a small ceremony that included his grandmother's blessing, his mother's tears, and a video call to her own mother in Enugu, who cried and apologized again, and this time, Amarachi let herself forgive, not because her family deserved it, but because she deserved the freedom of setting that weight down. A year into the marriage, she found out she was pregnant on a quiet Tuesday morning, staring at 2 pink lines the same way she'd once stared at a life that felt entirely out of her control. When she told Min-ho, the man who had once gone 20 years without smiling laughed so full and unguarded that Mrs. Lim, the housekeeper, came running from the kitchen to see what had happened. Their daughter was born the following spring, with her mother's fierce eyes and her father's quiet stillness, and when Min-ho held her for the first time, his hands that had once ended men's lives without hesitation, trembled with a gentleness the whole city would never have believed him capable of. "What do we name her?" Amarachi asked, exhausted and glowing in the hospital bed. "Grace," he said softly, remembering the very first thing he'd ever said to her, all those months ago in a hotel lounge. "Because that's what her name means in your language, isn't it? And because that's exactly what she is. What you both are. Grace I never earned but was given anyway." Years later, on quiet evenings in their home overlooking the city he no longer ruled through fear but through legitimate hands, Amarachi would sometimes think back to the woman who landed in Seoul with 1 suitcase and a family that had discarded her like she was disposable. She never regretted the road that led her there, because it had led her, eventually, to a man who chose her every single day, not out of obligation, not out of loneliness, but out of a love that had rebuilt him from the walls up. Family, she had learned, was never really about blood. It was about who showed up in the dark, who fought for you when the lights went out, who chose you again and again even after seeing every broken piece. And in a penthouse that had once been a fortress against feeling anything at all, a former mafia boss and the woman he had once been warned never to look in the eye built a home loud with laughter, full of jollof rice and Korean lullabies, and entirely, finally, safe. If this story made you feel something tonight, drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest, the warehouse, the proposal, or the ring on her finger. Subscribe if you believe love can find you even after everyone else has let you go, and I'll see you in the next story.